Welcome to the second of this series of 12 lessons on the Son of Promise and the Master Manipulator, looking at the lives of Isaac and Jacob from Genesis chapters 25 to 38. Before we get into the text, let's review what we covered in the last lesson. God made a covenant with Isaac's father Abraham, a Hebrew that he'd called from the land of Ur. He told Abraham that he would make of him a great nation, and through him all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Of course, to become a nation, that first meant he needed to have children. And at 75, he and his wife Sarah had none. She was 10 years younger than he was. God's timetable was a bit too slow for Abraham. Some years later, having no children, he named a trusted slave Eliezer as his heir. But God told him that Eliezer would not be his heir. His heir would be a son that he had fathered. Time continued to pass, still no child. Sarah decided to give Abraham her slave Hagar, and that he could have a child by her. Abraham agreed. Hagar became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son, Ishmael. But God told Abraham this was not the son of promise, that he would have a son by Sarah. Abraham was now 86, meaning Sarah was 76. Time continued on. God reaffirmed his covenant with Abraham, changing his name from Abram to Abraham, and his wife's name was changed from Sarai to Sarah. He told Abraham that the following year he would have a son by Sarah, at which Abraham laughed, thinking they were too old, he now being 99 and Sarah 89. When Sarah heard this a while later during the visit of 3 messengers from God, she also laughed. But a year later, Sarah gave birth to a son who was named Isaac, which does mean laughter. Abraham was now 100 years old. Sarah was now 90. We didn't cover much in Isaac's early life because that'll be covered when we study Abraham's life. But Isaac did grow. God told Abraham to offer him as a sacrifice. But if you remember, when Abraham was about to kill him, he provided a ram in his place. That's another lesson that we looked at a later time. But over time, Sarah died at the age of 127, and she was buried. Abraham at that time would have been 137. Isaac would have been 37 years old. Isaac needed a wife. So Abraham sent a trusted slave back to where Abraham's relatives had settled in Haran to find a wife for Isaac from among his relatives. And the slave found Rebekah, a granddaughter of Abraham's brother. She agreed to return to become Isaac's wife. Isaac was 40 when they married. We don't know Rebekah's age, but presume it was anywhere from 20 to 40, depending on what age she was. But she too could not conceive, and another 20 years went by. In the course of time, she gave birth to 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. She had a difficult pregnancy, and God told her that she was carrying 2 nations, but the older would serve the younger. As the boys grew up, the older son became Isaac's favorite, as he was a hunter and would bring game which Isaac loved to eat. Rebekah's favorite was Jacob, who settled in tents and seems to have tended the sheep. One day Esau came in extremely hungry. Jacob got him to give him his birthright as the oldest son in exchange for some soup and bread. And Esau did, and he despised his birthright. And that brings us to chapter 26. In this chapter, we'll see Isaac, part of his life, and especially his interaction with a neighboring king named Abimelech. Bill Gresham wrote about this chapter. He says this is the only, chapter 26 presents an encore of events, except this time they happen to Isaac instead of his father Abraham. Not only do we read again of famine and deception, but we also see a repetition of God's great promises. This is the only chapter which deals exclusively with Isaac. And we'll go through quite a few years in this one, chapters. And it skims a few highlights of his life. And we don't know when this takes place during Isaac's life. Although we left off in the last chapter with Esau and Jacob being grown, they're not mentioned until the end of this chapter. So they may have been grown and on their own during this time period, or this may have taken place before they were born, and just some incidents before that happened. Let's look at the text. I'm reading here from McCord's Everlasting Gospel, Hugo McCord's translation. A famine was in the land, besides the first famine in the days of Abraham, and Isaac went to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, at Gerar. Yahweh appeared to him, saying, "Do not go down to Egypt. Stay where I tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will bless you. For all these lands I have given to you and to your seed. And I will confirm the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. I will multiply your seed as the stars of heaven. I will give to your seed all these lands, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your seed. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my law." Isaac resided in Gerar, where the men of the place asked him about his wife. He told him, "She's my sister." For he was afraid to say my wife, lest, he said, the men of the place kill me on account of Rebekah, for she is beautiful. After they had been there a long time, Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, looked out a window and saw Isaac caressing Rebekah. And he called Isaac and said, "Certainly she's your wife. Why did you say she is my sister?" Isaac answered, "Because I said, lest I die on account of her." Abimelech replied, "What is this you've done to us? One of the people might have lain with your wife, and you have brought guilt on us." Then Abimelech gave orders to all the people, "He who touches this man or his wife will certainly die." So it's another famine that came on the land. This is not the one that Abraham went through earlier. And I wonder if this was put in the text here to clarify that these incidents are similar, that this really happened to Isaac as well as it did to Abraham. Peter Williams points out in his commentary that this was about 100 years after Abraham's famine. So it's been a number of years since then. Isaac went to Gerar, to Abimelech. Now, the text doesn't say where he had been living, as they were a bit nomadic, but somewhere in the Negev region there, in southern Israel. Abimelech was the king of the Philistines. History tells us that the bulk of the Philistines were still living on the island of Crete, but this colony seems to have already been settled in Palestine. Abimelech seems to have been the title of the kings of this area rather than one actual person, much like the term Pharaoh, which Egypt used for their kings, because Abraham dealt with an Abimelech as well. And if it was the same Abimelech, he'd be really, really old by now. So most likely this is just a title. Abimelech literally means "my father is king." God warned Isaac not to go to Egypt. If you remember, that's where Abraham had gone during his famine, and that's where people would normally have gone during a famine. But God says he'd take care of them, stay in the land. By the way, that's the first record of direct communication between God and Isaac. But from what we see from this, Isaac was to remain in the promised land. Notice on our map here, it has Gerar with a question mark. We don't really know precisely where it was, but it's thought that it was probably in that particular area. And that Bible study notes points out that the Hebrew verb ger means to live temporarily without ownership of the land. So Abraham's family would not actually possess the land of Canaan until the Israelite conquest hundreds of years later. Now, it may have been that he planned to continue traveling beyond Gerar, Isaac that is, and down towards Egypt. But this is the second time Isaac was been forbidden to leave the promised land. It might be that God did not want him to leave, because if he did, being only the second generation, he might never return. Jacob, though, if you remember, as we'll get to, spent large portions of his life outside the land, but he does come back and then leaves yet again. God then made the same promise to Isaac that he had made to Abraham. His descendants would be as the stars and would inhabit this land. This is God's first appearance and first promise to Isaac. Notice that the basis of God's promise is Abraham and Abraham's obedience. That Bible study note says, to you and your descendants, the Abrahamic blessing will pass to Isaac. Everything included in that blessing will now belong to the son, and in turn will be passed on to his sons. But there is a contingency involved. If they are to enjoy the full blessings, they will have to obey the word of the Lord. And so obedience is enjoined here with the example of how well Abraham obeyed. Isaac then did the same thing that Abraham had done. When asked about his wife, he told everyone that Rebekah was his sister, because he was afraid that someone might kill him for her. After all, he said she was very beautiful. Although she would be at least in her 40s by this time, could be in her 60s by now. Although a cousin of Isaac, Rebekah was not his sister. Notice that Isaac began practicing falsehood so soon after promising God that he would be faithful and true to him. Peter Williams wrote, "There's every possibility that he had learned of Abraham's experience earlier, but he failed to learn anything from it. For here he was telling a deliberate lie to protect his own life at the expense of Rebekah's virtue. It was cowardly and shameful and showed a complete lack of trust in God's promise to protect him in the land of the Philistines." Now, this deception did not reach the point that it twice did with Abraham. No one took Rebekah as their wife. Either Jacob and Esau were not there, or they were not grown and not easily identified as the children of both Isaac and Rebekah. There's no mention of the children here. They may have been left behind with some of their flocks and herds. This could be even taking place before they were born, as I mentioned earlier. There's no time frame given, so we don't know. Abimelech observed Isaac caressing Rebekah, deduced that they were actually husband and wife. The New International Version and the Net Bible both have caressing. English Standard Version has laughing with, but it footnotes that the Hebrew may suggest an intimate relationship, and I think it does here. The American Standard and King James versions have that they were sporting with. The New King James put he was showing endearment to. Whatever it was, it pretty well indicated they're more than just brother and sister. Abimelech called Isaac in, asked him why he had lied about Rebekah. Again, the Net Bible Study Notes comments that Isaac's deception made a mockery of God's covenantal promise. Ignoring God's promise to protect and bless him, Isaac lied to protect himself and acted in bad faith to the men of Gerar. Abimelech issued a warning to all the people. No one was to touch Isaac or Rebekah on the penalty of death. That they had been there a long time and no one had tried to take Rebekah would indicate that Isaac's worries were without substance. Moving on. Picking up with the next section. Isaac sowed in that land, and in that year he reaped 100-fold, for Yahweh blessed him. He prospered and became rich, very wealthy. He had flocks of sheep and herds of cattle and many servants, and the Philistines envied him. They stopped all the wells which the servants of Abraham had dug, filled them with dirt. Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we." Isaac left and camped in the valley of Gerar and resided there. He redug the wells which Abraham his father had dug, gave them the names which his father had used. Isaac's servants were digging in the valley and found spring water. The herdsmen of Gerar contended with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, "The water's ours." Isaac called the well's name Esek, which means strife, for they had striven with him. His servants dug another well, and they contended for it also, and he called its name Sitnah, which means enmity. Then he moved away and dug another well, for which they did not contend. He called its name Rehoboth, which means room, and said, "Now Yahweh has made room for us, and we will be fruitful in the land." Then he went up from there to Beersheba, where on that same night Yahweh appeared to him and said, "I am the God of Abraham your father. Do not be afraid, for I am with you, and I will bless you, and I will multiply your seed for the sake of Abraham my servant." There he built an altar and called on the name of Yahweh, and there he pitched his tent. And there Isaac's servants dug a well. God blessed Isaac, and Isaac became rich and wealthy. This seems to be on top of what he would inherit from Abraham if he's not yet inherited it. Notice the mention that Isaac planted. He planted crops and yielded 100-fold. That's something that Abraham apparently never did. This would require some land. So either Abimelech allowed Isaac the use of the land, or he allowed Isaac to rent the land, as the emphasis seems to be that he's still a nomad. Bill Grasham writes about this, says, since ancient times, Bedouins, who are a nomadic people, Bedouins have sown and harvested some crops in the semi-arid part of the world. However, dryland farming was difficult at that time, and certainly did not usually produce 100 seeds to every one that was sown. Since Isaac is the only patriarch who's said to have practiced agriculture, this abundant harvest confirms that the Lord blessed him there. The famine may have convinced them that having a reliable source of food for his flock and herds was advisable. This is the first mention, by the way, of planting seeds in the Bible. Such a bountiful harvest at the time of famine undoubtedly pointed to God's blessing Isaac. But the Philistines in that locality became jealous of what he had, and Abimelech asked Isaac to leave. "You've become much more powerful than we are," which would indicate the Philistines are not a nation yet, just a colony. The Hebrew word here for jealousy refers to an intense envy that leads to hostile action. Isaac and his family were being threatened. In the meantime, Abraham's wells had been filled in by the Philistines, probably out of spite towards Isaac, or to try to prevent Abraham or Isaac from returning there. Henry Morris says, evidently the Philistine settlers were not yet numerous or prosperous enough themselves to need them, but wanted to discourage others from settling there in the meantime, as they were trying to maintain a claim to the land themselves. Isaac left the area, redigging the wells that Abraham had dug as he went, and he gave them the names that Abraham had given them. This might have been seen as a threat to his trying to claim the land. And he didn't totally leave the area. He left Gerar, but he settled in the valley of Gerar, so he's still in the immediate area. Bill Grasham talks about this valley. He says, the Hebrew word for valley, nakal, refers to a ravine that is called a wadi in Israel today. This type of riverbed is usually dry, but it becomes a raging torrent during the rainy season. A wadi is an excellent place to dig a well because the water sinks down through the rock, sand, and soil until it rests on a bedrock formation. There it settles as a basin of clean water. Such a well could have supplied water for a number of Bedouins in the area. In the valley, he found a well of springing water. Probably this is a spring-fed well. And that he began having problems with Abimelech's herdsmen. He would dig a well, and they would claim it belonged to them. Same thing happened with Abraham. The first well he called Isaac, contention. He moved on, dug a second well, but it was contested. It was named Sitnah, enmity. Isaac was slowly being pushed further and further from Gerar, and he went out even further to dig more wells. At the third well that he dug, no one contested their rights to it, so they named it Rehoboth, or room, or possibly broad places. In other words, he was saying by digging this well and naming it, there's now room to live. One thing we see from this is that Isaac was a peaceable man. He didn't want to cause trouble, so each time he simply moved on. Bill Grasham comments that from this account, we see that Isaac was a very different kind of person than his father. When Abraham had problems with people, he confronted them and settled the situation, which it was strife between his herdsmen and those of Lot, the invasion of the four kings from the east, problems with Hagar and Ishmael in chapter 21, or difficulties with the Philistines. Isaac avoided confrontation if he could. He suffered injustice rather than standing up for his rights. He tried to be at peace with all men, as Paul wrote in Romans 12, and not take his own revenge on the Philistines who had stolen his wells. Now, this is not to say that Abraham was wrong in his approach, but that Isaac did it differently. And we too are to live at peace with all around us, as Paul's quote in Romans 12 tells us. But sometimes people don't want peace, and life ends up not being very peaceful. Eventually, Isaac traveled back to Beersheba. God appeared to him a second time with the promise. He appeared to him to comfort and to reassure him, particularly after the problems they had had among the Philistines. He had no reason to fear. God was with him. Isaac built an altar and dug a well there. That would indicate they're planning to stay for a while. This is the only altar that it's recorded that Isaac built. Now, he could have built others, or he could have used the ones Abraham had built earlier. The actual Hebrew wording about the well here is that they began to dig a well there. They didn't actually find water until we get down to verse 32. So continuing on in our reading, Abimelech came to him from Gerar, and with him were Ahuzath, his counselor, and Phicol, his army captain. Isaac asked them, "Why have you come to me, since you hate me and you sent me away from you?" They replied, "We have certainly seen that Yahweh is with you, and we say, let there now be an oath between us and you. Let's make a covenant that you will not harm us as we have not hurt you, and as we have done only good to you, and have sent you, now the blessed of Yahweh, away in peace." Isaac made a feast for them, and they ate and drank. They arose early in the morning and swore man to man, and Isaac sent them away in peace. On that same day, Isaac's servants reported to him about the well they had dug and said, "We have found water." He called the name Sheba, swearing, and therefore the name of the city is Beersheba to this day. When Esau was 40 years old, he took as wives Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. They were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. So Abimelech comes to visit Isaac, bringing along with him a counselor and his army captain. It may be that Phicol is not his name, but may have been a title for commander-in-chief, or even the son of the previous commander-in-chief, and having the same name. But they had seen that God was with Isaac. They wanted to have a covenant of friendship with him. Now that he left their land and was quite powerful, it was to their advantage to do that. So they wanted a peace treaty. Bill Grasham says, "This does not mean that these Philistines believed in the Lord Yahweh as the one true God to the exclusion of all other gods, but they may have perceived Isaac's God to be more powerful than their own gods. Therefore, the wise strategy was to avoid offending him, or incurring his wrath. They want to make peace. So they made an oath and a covenant not to harm each other, which would of necessity included the recognition of Isaac's water rights. Covenant making often included a covenant meal, the feast which we see Isaac made for them there. It was that same day that Isaac's servants found water, and the site was again named Beersheba. The Bible study notes comments on this double naming of this area. They said, the name Beersheba means well of an oath or well of seven. According to Genesis 21:31, Abraham gave Beersheba its name when he made a treaty with the Philistines. Because of the parallels between this earlier story and the account in chapter 26, some scholars see chapters 21 and 26 as two versions or doublets of one original story. However, if one takes the text as it stands, it appears that Isaac made a later treaty agreement with the people of the land that was similar to his father's. Abraham had dug a well at the site and named the place Beersheba. Isaac dug another well there and named the well Sheba. Later generations then associated the name Beersheba with Isaac, even though Abraham gave the place its name at an earlier time. As far as we can tell, this is the same place where Abraham had made the treaty and dug the well. So it's now doubly the well of the oath. Esau is now 40 years old, so we resume what was going on in the chapter 25. Esau took two wives, Judith, who was a Hittite, and Basemath, who was also a Hittite. They made life bitter, or caused great anxiety for Isaac and Rebekah. We're not told why. Possibly what they did, because they were idol worshippers, or possibly it's just because Esau married Canaanite women. Bill Grasham writes, why did Esau, unlike his brother Jacob, marry outside the line of Terah? Did he do so out of deliberate defiance to his parents' wishes, Or was marriage to the nearby Hittite women more convenient than making a long trek to Haran to find a wife from among his grandfather's clan? The latter possibility seems more probable, given the indifferent attitude that he demonstrated towards his birthright. We can begin to see why Jacob was the obvious choice to be the next head of the family, even though Esau was the oldest, at least by a few minutes. This is also preparing the ground for Isaac to be sent back to Rebekah's home country for a wife. That's going to happen 2 chapters from now. As a point of note, Isaac would be at this time 100 years old. Rebekah would be somewhere between 80 and 100. And Jacob would also be 40, because after all, he and Esau are twins. Abraham would have died by this time. One thing that comes through in this chapter is God's willingness to bless Isaac time after time, despite the way that Isaac was not living as he should all the time. Jim McGuigan comments as sort of a lesson that we can learn. Therefore, implicit in these chapters is the grace of God toward unworthy people. Israel and we have a lot to learn from all this. The elect weren't elite. They had no real grounds for feeling morally superior. There were differences between them and the society in which they lived, of course, but they didn't always compare favorably. I thought he had a good point there. Here's some other lessons that we can learn. I think especially learn from the life of Isaac. Honesty is always the best policy. Don't betray yourself or anyone else as someone they are not. It got Abraham in trouble. It got Isaac in trouble. It gets us in trouble today. Faithfulness to God can bring jealousy and opposition from others. If we're following God, we have probably at some point experienced this. But we still should be faithful despite the opposition. A third lesson. We need, as much as is possible, to live peaceably with all people. Isaac's a good example of this. Sometimes we like to stir up trouble, but we shouldn't be doing that in light of what Paul wrote to the Christians in Romans. But possibly that would lead us to this lesson as well. We need to be friendly with those around us. There's no need to be antagonistic towards people. We need to learn to be friendly. And that's what we see in Isaac as well. Thank you for joining us for this lesson. In our next lesson, we'll be going on into chapter 27, looking at Jacob and Esau a bit more. If you get a chance, read through that chapter, and we'll get that lesson posted very, very soon.